The first time I heard about the Lost Ridge Trail, I was sitting on the porch of an old ranger station near the Smokies, talking to a retired fire lookout named Walt. He had a voice like gravel, and the kind of eyes that had seen every ridge and storm in those mountains. Over a chipped enamel mug of coffee, he told me about a spur trail that used to lead to a hidden overlook. A view, he said, that could make a preacher forget his sermon. The problem was, the Forest Service had stopped maintaining it sometime back in the 70s. After a landslide and some funding cuts, the path had vanished into the undergrowth, swallowed by rhododendron and thyme. Most folks wrote it off as mountain lore, but Walt swore it was still up there, waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it. I decided right then that someone would be me. That night, by lantern light in my tent, I studied a photocopy of an old hand-drawn map Walt had sketched from memory. The paper was stained and soft at the folds, with a few notes in the margins, things like "Look for split oak," "Creek turns west," and "Ridge before third hollow." It was the kind of map that tested your ability to see the land the way people once did, by shape, sound, and instinct, more than by coordinates. I packed light the next morning. A compass, a knife, some jerky, a water filter, and a small tarp. No GPS, no digital map. I wanted this the old way. By mid-morning, I reached the last marked junction on the modern trail, a faint wooden sign nearly overtaken by moss. From there, it was just me and the mountain. I found what might have been the beginning of the old path, a slight depression in the forest floor where leaves didn't quite sit right. Maybe it was just runoff. Maybe it was history. Either way, I followed it. The forest closed in quickly. Vines twisted across the slope, and thickets of laurel clawed at my sleeves. Every now and then, I'd spot an old blaze, so faded it looked like nothing more than a pale scar on the bark. I began to trust the land more than the signs, listening to the way the slope tilted, noticing how the trees changed as I climbed. Pine gave way to hardwood, the air cooled, and I started hearing the distant murmur of water. It was faint but steady, like a whisper just over the ridge. There's a certain kind of silence that only comes when you're far off any real trail. No distant voices, no hum of traffic. Just the breath of the woods and your own heartbeat. I stopped once to drink from a stream, watching the sunlight flicker off the ripples, and thought about how many boot soles had passed this way decades before. Maybe some old hiker had stood right here, looking at the same shimmer of light through the trees. That thought kept me moving, tracing the bones of the old path up toward whatever secret the mountain had been keeping. The climb grew steeper as the day stretched on, the sun tilting westward through the canopy. The faint line of the old trail would appear and vanish again like a ghost. One moment, a clear bend between stones. The next, swallowed by ferns and fallen branches. More than once, I had to stop and guess whether I was still following it or simply imagining the path I wanted to see. The forest was thick with the scent of moss and wet earth. Every breath felt like drinking green air. I could tell no one had been up this way in years, maybe decades. The only tracks were deer prints and the faint drag of a bear's paw through the mud near a spring. Around mid-afternoon, I came to the creek Walt had marked with a crooked arrow on his map. "Creek turns west," he'd written, and sure enough, it did, curling back on itself in a lazy horseshoe. The map said to follow it upstream until Rockface sings. I didn't know what that meant, but as I hiked along the bank, I began to hear something faint, almost like a hum or echo that didn't belong to water alone. Then I saw it. A narrow chute of stone, worn smooth where the creek rushed through a fissure in the rock. The current made a sound like a low whistle when it hit the hollow. Maybe that was the singing Walt meant. I smiled. It felt like solving a riddle whispered by the woods themselves. From there, I started climbing again. The map mentioned a split oak at the ridge's base, and when I finally found it, two thick trunks grown from the same root, twisting apart like fighting brothers, I sat beneath it to rest. My legs ached, my shirt clung to my back, and the shadows were starting to lengthen. The ridge above was steep, more of a scramble than a hike. I figured if I didn't make the overlook by sundown, I'd camp on the ridge crest and finish in the morning. The higher I climbed, the wilder it got. Fallen trees forced detours, and thick tangles of rhododendron turned each step into a wrestling match. At one point, I slipped on loose scree and slid a few feet before catching a sapling. The ground there was soft, almost spongy, covered in decades of needles and rot. When I looked back down, the valley stretched out behind me, bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. I could see how far I'd come and how much farther the ridge went. But something about the air changed. It smelled different up there, fresher, like rain and stone. Then I saw it. A line of old cut stumps, their tops silvered with age. Someone had once cleared this section, proof that a trail had truly existed. My pulse quickened. The wind picked up and carried a faint, distant roar, the unmistakable rush of falling water. Walt's hidden overlook was close now. I could feel it in my bones. Every instinct told me to push on, though daylight was slipping fast. Somewhere beyond those trees, the mountain was keeping its secret, and I was almost ready to meet it. The ridge narrowed into a spine of rock, rising out of the trees like the backbone of some ancient creature. Every few yards, I had to duck under low branches or edge along slanted stone slick with lichen. The sound of the waterfall grew louder, not a trickle or gentle cascade, but a deep, pulsing roar that vibrated through the ground. I crested a small rise, and the forest suddenly opened into a clearing so sudden it stopped me in my tracks. Ferns carpeted the ground, and shafts of golden light speared through gaps in the canopy. Ahead, a wall of stone curved out from the ridge, draped in moss and mist. The old path, little more than a memory now, led straight to the edge. I knew before I reached it that I'd found Walt's lost overlook. The air grew cooler, and droplets of spray drifted upward like floating dust. Then the trees fell away, and there it was, the waterfall. It wasn't enormous, maybe 70 feet tall, but it spilled from a notch in the cliffs like a sheet of glass, catching the late sun and breaking it into ribbons of colour. Below it spread a narrow valley, so green it almost glowed, untouched and silent, except for the endless rush of water. I'd been hiking the mountains for decades, and I'd seen my share of beauty, but this was something purer. It was as though I'd stepped into a place that had been waiting all these years for someone to remember it existed. I dropped my pack and sat on a flat rock, just breathing it in. The map had led me true, even after all those decades. Somewhere, I imagined, old Walt smiling into his coffee cup, knowing some fool had finally followed his ghost trail. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. Pieces of weathered lumber half buried in moss. A handrail post. The remains of an old bench. Someone had built a viewing platform here long ago, maybe for forest rangers or a local hiking club, and time had quietly taken it back. The forest had done what it always does, erased human footprints until only hints remained. I stood and moved closer to the cliff's edge, where the rock dipped slightly. From there, I could see a faint side path winding downward along the slope, almost invisible beneath the brush. The roar of the falls pulled at me like a magnet. I wanted to see the base, to stand in that spray and look up from below. But it was late. The sky had turned copper and the shadows stretched long and sharp. One wrong step in failing light could send me tumbling. I wrestled with it for a moment, that old explorer's itch versus the hard-earned caution of experience. Finally, I decided to camp right there on the ridge. The spot had a view like a painting and enough flat ground for my tarp. I gathered fallen wood, struck a small fire, and as twilight deepened, I sat with my back against my pack, watching the mist rise like smoke from the gorge below. The fire crackled low, the forest settling into its night sounds. Crickets, wind, the constant hush of water. Somewhere out there, the ghosts of those who once walked this trail seemed to whisper in the dark. I felt both entirely alone and completely connected, part of a story far older than my own. Sometime after midnight, the world shifted. I woke to the distant rumble of thunder, low and heavy, echoing through the valley like a drumbeat. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the air had turned thick, humid, too still for comfort. I could feel the pressure building in my ears, that subtle warning the mountain gives before a storm. I got up, tightened the guy lines on my tarp, and stowed what I could in my pack. The stars vanished behind a curtain of cloud, and within minutes, the first drops fell, fat, cold, and scattered. Then the rain came in earnest. It started as a steady patter, then grew into a downpour that hammered the tarp like a drum. Lightning flashed, turning the ridge silver white, and for an instant, I saw the waterfall below illuminated in ghostly light. The water looked alive, thrashing and gleaming, as if the whole mountain were exhaling. The thunder came right after, shaking the air so hard I felt it in my chest. I hunkered close to the ground, pulling the tarp tighter, waiting out the worst of it. There's a strange mix of fear and awe in moments like that. You realize how small you are compared to everything around you, how little your will matters against wind and water. The storm raged for over an hour, the ridge trembling beneath the weight of the rain. I watched rivulets form, carving fresh channels into the soil, washing away years of fallen leaves. When it finally eased, I crawled out and stood in the cool mist, soaked to the bone, but grinning like a fool. The air smelled of lightning and pine sap. Down below, the waterfall had swollen, roaring even louder now. I could see the faint gleam of the pool at its base, moonlight just starting to break through the torn clouds. Something in me couldn't rest. Maybe it was the storm's energy still humming in my veins, or maybe it was pure stubborn curiosity. I grabbed my headlamp and started down the narrow side path I'd spotted earlier, testing each step. The ground was slick, the undergrowth dripping wet, and every few yards a branch would snap back against my shoulder. The sound of the falls grew louder with every turn until it filled my whole head. Then, the path ended abruptly at a jumble of boulders, beyond which was the pool itself, a dark mirror reflecting the sky. The water churned, wild and cold, throwing mist into the air. I edged closer and crouched on one of the rocks, letting the spray hit my face. The beam of my headlamp caught something glinting beneath the water, a fragment of metal. I reached down and pulled it free. A rusted trail marker. the old kind they used to nail into trees. The paint was long gone, but I could still make out faint letters. Lost Ridge Overlook. I held it for a while, feeling the rough weight of it, like I was holding a relic from another world. Then I set it on a rock near the shore, where the next wanderer, if there ever was one, might find it again. By the time I climbed back up to camp, the sky had cleared completely. Stars burned bright and sharp, and the whole valley glittered with dew. I lay beneath my tarp, listening to the steady heartbeat of the falls and thinking how some secrets don't stay lost forever. They just wait for the right kind of persistence to rediscover them. Dawn crept in softly, like someone lifting the edge of a blanket from the world. The first thing I noticed was the smell, the clean, wet scent that follows a storm when everything feels rinsed new. Mist still clung to the treetops, and the sun, slow and gold, began to warm the ridge. My fire pit was a ring of damp ash, but I coaxed a little smoke from it anyway, more for comfort than heat. Coffee grounds in a tin cup never taste better than after a long night on a mountain. The waterfall still roared below, steady and strong, as if nothing that had happened, neither time nor storm, had ever truly touched it. I sat there, watching the light crawl down into the valley, revealing what I hadn't seen the evening before. Moss-covered stones marked where the old overlook once stood. In full, the posts forming a faint square. Someone had built this place to share a view, not just find it. Maybe rangers used to bring visitors up here, or maybe it was a local secret passed around in quiet talk over campfires, just like it had reached me through Walt. For a moment, I imagined them, those hikers from long ago, standing right where I was, pointing out the same ridgelines, laughing, taking in the same endless spread of green. It felt less like discovery and more like reunion. Before I broke camp, I walked once more to the edge and looked out. The world below shimmered, every leaf tipped with light. That waterfall, hidden for decades behind tangled growth, poured over the cliff like a living thread, tying past and present together. I knew that by nightfall, no one else might stand here again for years, or ever. But that didn't feel sad. It felt right. Some places are meant to stay quiet, to remind us there's still mystery in the world, something you can't find on a map or screen. I packed up slow, taking only what I'd brought, leaving the old trail marker glinting faintly where I'd set it. When I started down the ridge, I marked a few turns with stacked stones, not enough to spoil the secrecy, just enough for someone with the same kind of curiosity to pick up the thread. The woods were bright now, alive with birdsong. I could hear the drip of water from every branch, the chatter of a squirrel somewhere above me. The mountain no longer felt indifferent. It felt awake. When I reached the junction with the modern trail again, the world seemed oddly civilized. Flat tread, clear blazes, footprints of strangers. I turned back once, half expecting to see the ghost of the old trail shimmer in the morning haze. But there was only sunlight through the trees. I smiled. I'd found what I came for, but more than that, I'd found a reminder that adventure still lives in the forgotten corners of familiar places. That night, back at my truck, I unfolded Walt's hand-drawn map and added one more note beneath his scribbles. Trail still there, still singing. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it into my pack, ready to hand it off someday to another wanderer, listening for the whisper of lost paths.